If you're not a Xiangling main, it's likely you've been playing CRYO Impact for the past few months. For some reason, miHoYo made all of the CRYO units in the game absolutely jacked, and well, I have good news for you, because with the addition of Shenhe to the game, CRYO characters are now on steroids. I've been testing Shenhe in early access for a few weeks now, so I can bring you the most accurate, thorough, comprehensive guide on Shenhe. So today in this guide, we're going to be talking about Shenhe, how she works, her best teams, builds, and give a review at the end of the video. If you have not gotten Shenhe yet and you want to know if she's worth pulling for, I highly recommend you watch the review segment of the video, because I'm going to be brutally honest about her strengths and weaknesses. And hey, if you liked the video, it would mean a ton to me if you dropped a like or just commented something nice. With all that in mind, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Shenhe. So Shenhe has a super interesting kit that revolves around buffing your team and debuffing enemies, and in that way she's pretty similar to Kazuha, but the main difference would be that Shenhe is much more limited in that she only focuses on cryo damage. When you activate her elemental skill, your team gains stacks off of quills, which are essentially a damage buff that applies to each cryo damage hit based off of Shenhe's attack stat. Her elemental skill has a tap variant and a hold variant, and when you use the tap variant, she does a dash forward, generates 3 particles, and gains 5 quills. With her hold skill though, she does a circle AoE of cryo damage that generates 4 particles and gives 7 quills. Every character on your team has an independent quill stack that all burns separately of each other. And to burn a quill stack, you just have to do any instance of cryo damage, and it's going to buff that instance of cryo for that specific character and use 1 quill stack on that specific character. If you have multiple cryo damage sources at once, they're all going to be burning their own stacks of quills. For that reason, running multiple cryo units with Shenhe can be really strong. Her hold cooldown is 15 seconds and her tap cooldown is only 10 seconds, and generally speaking, you're going to want to use her tap skill more because over time it'll generate more particles and quills. The exception to this is Melt Ganyu, which I'll explain in the team section. The other reason you're going to tap more is because Shenhe's second Ascension passive gives 15% elemental damage bonus for 10 seconds. Some characters like Ganyu, for example, can snapshot that burst damage increase. If you don't tap and you choose to hold, you get 15% normal charged and plunging attack bonus for 15 seconds, but generally that utility is less useful. For Shenhe's elemental burst, she activates an AoE that deals damage over 12 seconds, and the initial hit has a super low multiplier, and the damage over time isn't super amazing, but the main thing about Shenhe's burst is that it shreds cryo and physical resistance within the area. The higher level the talent is, the more shred it gives, with up to 15% resistance shred at level 10. Also know that Shenhe's burst can snapshot buffs, so if you use something like Bennett's burst and then use her burst, she'll retain the attack buff even after Bennett's burst is gone. Lastly, Shenhe's Ascension 1 passive gives 15% more cryo damage bonus when you're inside of Shenhe's burst field. Overall, it's just a blanket buff to your team. It's actually pretty good though. When you're leveling up Shenhe's talents, you should focus on her elemental skill first, because her skill is what's going to give your team the biggest buff, and then after that you can focus on her elemental burst, because that'll increase the damage done over time and the amount of resistance shred it gives. If you're going to level up normal attacks, it should be your last priority. So that's the gist of how Shenhe's kit works. Essentially, you're just going to bring her on the field for buffs with her elemental skill, and then you're going to activate her elemental burst for resistance shred and cryo damage, and then on top of that, your cryo DPS will get a ton of enhanced cryo damage from her quill buffs. So next up is going to be Shenhe weapons, which get kind of complicated because her weapon ranking can change based on the team you're running. I had some friends help me out with Shenhe weapon charts based on DPS, freeze, and melt teams, so I'm going to show the freeze and melt team charts on screen. Keep in mind that this is total damage potential based on Shenhe's damage and how much her quills will buff your teammates. I was surprised to find that Engulfing Lightning actually beats out Calamity Queller for overall damage. Now, to be honest, the difference is almost negligible, and Calamity Queller is still super solid on her. It's just that Shenhe needs energy recharge anyways, and Engulfing Lightning buffs her attack based on her energy recharge, so it works out to be higher total value in stats. Outside of those two, Homa, Jade Spear, Skyward Spine, Lithic Spear, and Wavebreaker R5 are all solid on Shenhe for damage and team contribution, but the weapon I'm going to recommend if you don't have Calamity Queller or Engulfing Lightning is Favonius Lance. Now, the main reason I'm recommending Favonius Lance is because its base attack isn't bad for a 4-star, which will help out with Shenhe's buff. It's fairly accessible for free-to-play accounts, being that it's not a 5-star weapon. It appears on a lot of weapon banners and the standard banner, and it generates extra energy particles when you crit. Now, Shenhe being a cryo character that gets played in cryo teams will have cryo resonance, which will give you 15% more crit rate passively, so you'll be able to crit with Favonius with little investment. Overall, Favonius is a super solid baseline weapon and what I highly recommend using on her. I also want to mention 2 free-to-play weapons as well for those of you guys who don't have the other options, because I know there's going to be lots of people who are new to the game or just have those weapons on other characters. So the 2 weapons I want to talk about are Prototype Star Glitter and the Catch. Prototype Star Glitter and the the Catch are both excellent options for free-to-play players to be able to hit the energy recharge threshold that you'll need to make sure your burst is up all the time. And while I'd advise using Prototype Star Glitter on Shenhe, I actually wouldn't recommend using the Catch on her. And the reason for that is just because there's so many other characters that are probably going to want to use it more. Now, if you have the Catch R5 and nobody in either of your Abyss teams is using the Catch, then sure, you can use it on Shenhe, but do be warned, both these weapons don't have amazing base attack, and it will be hard to get your Shenhe buff improved. So overall, I recommend Favonius Lance for free-to-play and low spenders. Again, you guys, it's going to be all down in the description if you want to check out the document yourself. Otherwise, let's get moving on to artifacts. So artifacts for Shenhe are actually really straightforward. She needs as much attack as you can get, but she has energy problems with her 80 cost burst. Because of that, her best options are going to be 2-piece Shimenawa and 2-piece Gladiators for a bunch of attack bonus. Now, it is okay to use 2 Emblem of Severed Fate as well, just to alleviate some of the energy issues, and I'll get specific on how much energy you need in the stats section here in a second. Just know for now that for a support build on Shenhe, these are the sets and combos you want to use. Now, if Shenhe is just your favorite character in the game and you want to use it for DPS, she's not incredibly strong for it in comparison to other cryo units, but she can be built to deal decent cryo damage. For any sort of DPS focus build on Shenhe, 4-piece Blizzard Strayer will be solid because it's going to give you 40 crit rate in permafreeze and 20 crit rate in cryo focused teams. It's overall just really solid and lets you funnel all of your stats into crit damage. Generally speaking though, I don't recommend building Shenhe for DPS because her personal damage isn't great with the DPS build, and as a support, she needs to have an attack focus so your cryo main DPS can do tons more damage. I tested it a ton even with characters like Zhongyun just to get the cryo infusion and things like that. I really tried to make her a good DPS, but overall building Shenhe with an attack focus always ended up being more damage overall. Just because a buffed Ganyu, a buffed Ayaka, a Shenhe buffed cryo character is going to do a lot more damage than Shenhe herself. Lastly, I know a couple content creators are probably going to recommend this, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking about how good Noblesse might be on Shenhe. Now, typically, Noblesse is great on support characters because it gives your team a 20% attack buff when you use the Wielder's Burst, but the problem in Shenhe's case is that many other characters on Shenhe teams can also hold Noblesse. Diona, Xingqiu, Rosaria, Mona are all examples of characters that can hold Noblesse well, and so typically you just don't really need it on Shenhe. But that's without even mentioning that building attack on her ends up being more valuable anyways, just because of how her quills actually contribute to your team's damage. So overall, I don't recommend Noblesse. It's not going to be the end of the world if you choose to use it, but 2 Gladiators, 2 Shimenawa, and 2 Emblem of Severed Fate, or any combination of those 3 is generally going to be better. And now let's move on to artifact stats. So this section actually is going to be a little bit longer than usual, and the main reason is because I want to clarify some things. I get a lot of questions about this on my videos. So when we talk about stats typically, I'll mention an energy recharge amount you'll want to have to consistently get a character's burst up. When calculating and testing how much energy recharge you need on a character to have its best burst up time, you're taking into account energy particle generation and amount of enemies that you're fighting. In some floors of Abyss and in the overworld, you won't have energy problems at all because you just have a lot of enemies to defeat, which all drop extra particles. Now, the energy recharge amounts that I list are specifically in reference to content with fewer enemies, like the higher floors of Spiral Abyss, where you won't have many enemies to defeat for particles, and your burst won't be ready as often. Using the energy recharge numbers I list will make it so that even against one enemy, your burst uptime will be super consistent. So for Shenhe, you generally want between 160 and 180 energy recharge if you have Favonius Lance, but if you don't have Favonius Lance on, you're going to want 190 to 220 energy recharge. You'll be able to hit the energy threshold with no problem with an energy recharge weapon, but if you can get enough energy recharge substats, it can be pretty game changing since you can just run an attack sands instead. Overall, your priority should be energy to the thresholds listed, and if you can't get to those numbers, use an energy recharge sands. If your substats have enough energy though, you can run triple attack with attack sands, attack goblet, and attack circlet to give your cryo team big buffs. Crit rate as a substat isn't bad, but with cryo resonance, you don't really need as much of it to proc Favonius Lance. So overall, your best option is going to be attack sands, attack goblet, and attack circlet. However, it's more important that you get your energy recharge up first, so if you can't run triple attack and still meet the threshold of high energy recharge, then I highly recommend using an energy recharge sands instead. So when I talk about teams, I approach teams from a meta perspective, but there are some characters who don't fit into top meta teams, and as a result, myself and theory crafters will test and play some teams that just feel nice and fun to play, and will be mathematically good in comparison to other options. That being said, these teams aren't the end-all be-all, and you're free to play the game however you feel like. There are plenty more teams than I'm going to be listing today, but these are just 4 of my favorites. In general, Shenhe likes cryo damage dealers, and a lot of them. The more cryo damage dealers you have on your team, the more value you get out of Shenhe's elemental skill and quills. So the first team that I want to show you guys today is going to be Ganyu, Ayaka, Shenhe, and Jean or Sucrose. Shenhe really shines in mono cryo because her quills from her elemental skill are going to buff Ganyu, Ayaka, Rosaria, Kaya, whatever your cryo carries are going to be. In a team like this, you can freely use Ayaka and Ganyu's burst while also swirling cryo with Sucrose or Jean. Kazuha can also fit into here, but one of the nice things about Shenhe is if you're using her in a cryo team, you can actually free up Kazuha for your other team. In addition to all that, Sucrose can get extra cryo damage for your team at C6, and combined with Shenhe's buffs and debuffs, this team can output really solid damage. The next team I want to talk about is relatively free-to-play friendly, and that's going to be Reverse Melt Rosaria, Bennett, Xiangling, and Shenhe. Reverse Melt Rosaria with Shenhe is actually very strong, and here's why. Rosaria's damage output per burst tick is actually very high at high investment. With Shenhe in the mix, your Rosaria melts are going to do super high damage. You can also run Kazuha instead of Xiangling if you have access to him, because he's going to be able to apply Pyro very quickly as well, and also use Viridescent Venom to shred cryo resistance. Rosaria burst ticks are so slow that Kazuha and Xiangling will both consistently keep Pyro applied to enemies, and Rosaria is going to always hit the reverse melt. The next team that I want to show you guys is going to be a variant of Morgana that's going to feature Ganyu, Venti, Mona, and Shenhe. Or you can use Ayaka instead of Ganyu, it really doesn't make a difference. The main difference between this and Morgana is that you're actually replacing Diana with Shenhe. Since enemies will be permanently frozen, you don't really have to worry about taking damage anyways. That being said, using Ayaka and Ganyu would be stronger than using Ayaka Shenhe or Ganyu Shenhe, but not everyone has access to both those characters, in which case Shenhe can be a strong fourth character. The final team I want to show you guys, and my personal favorite, is going to be Reverse Melt Ganyu. Earlier, I mentioned that you would want to use her tap skill most of the time to generate energy faster and technically gain more quills over time. In this case, holding her elemental skill is actually better. The reason for that is because her Ascension 2 is going to buff normal, charged, and plunging attacks when you use her hold skill, and that'll buff Ganyu shots a ton. This team is meant to swirl Pyro with Kazuha, but you also have the option of running Xiangling instead. It can just be more difficult because you have to be point blank with Xiangling, so that way you can consistently apply Pyro, and obviously if you're doing aimed shots, that can be really hard. But in general, I like this team a lot because honestly, it just hits really big numbers and gives me an insane dopamine response. Now, I know all of the teams that I listed are pretty expensive to build, and that's one of the weaknesses that I found with Shenhe in general. If you're looking for other characters that work well with her, characters like Mona and Kokomi complement her super well, and Xingqiu if you're using an Ayaka for a freeze team. I haven't found a lot of value with her in a Geo or an Electro focused team, because even though she debuffs physical resistance, that's only a small portion of her kit, and there are lots of other characters that can fill that role better. Now, that's not to say Shenhe in a physical team is useless, but it's just not optimal. But I guess my main point is just to play around with running lots of cryo damage, and in general, Shenhe will fit any one of those teams fairly well. I'm also 100% sure that someone's gonna say, you forgot Chongyun, or you overlooked Chongyun. Here's the problem. Chongyun would actually be a decent unit for mono cryo or for a freeze team if you just want to get that cryo infusion, but his biggest problem is just that he's overshadowed by so many other units that just do his job better. They do either more damage, they generate more particles. Yes, no other character is able to infuse cryo like he can, but in a Shenhe team, that's basically all that he brings to the table, and so I wouldn't recommend using a team with Chongyun in it for Abyss. However, if you want to make Chongyun your main DPS, Chongyun's best team will feature Shenhe, so for Chongyun mains, the option is there. So before I give the final review, I do want to go over constellation value because for low spenders, lucky players, and whales, there are some good and bad things about our constellations. If you're not really interested in the constellation section, I would skip on ahead to the review, but you might learn something if you hang around. First, Constellation 1 gives you an extra charge on Shenhe's elemental skill. Unfortunately, this doesn't give you more quills, it just overwrites the amount you have. For example, if you have a hold skill and you follow it up by a tap skill for the second charge, your quills will become 5 instead of 7. Overall, this constellation is kind of bad since the cooldowns of both charges are counted separately. If you have this constellation, you'll only use the second charge once during a fight. It can battery Shenhe once at the start of the fight, and that's it. Her Constellation 2 is actually a decent buff though. It makes her burst last 6 seconds longer, and inside of her burst, all cryo crit damage will be increased by 15%. Now, the buff can't be snapshotted, but it's a small kit improvement that'll actually go a long way in mono cryo. Her Constellation 3 increases the level of her skill by 3, which is pretty decent because it increases her damage buff. Constellation 4 gives Shenhe stacks of Skyfrost mantra when she uses quills. The description is really wordy, but essentially what you need to know is each Skyfrost mantra stack increases her next elemental skill damage by 5%, and you get 1 per quill that you use. It's really not super useful unless you're C6, because the amount of quills you get at C0 just isn't great. Her Constellation 5 increases her burst level by 3, and Constellation 6 makes it so that normal and charged attacks don't use quills, which is absolutely insane and broken for Ayaka and Ganyu, and if you're a whale, this character is going to be nuts for them. But for low spenders, to be brutally honest, it's not worth intentionally going for constellations on her, like at all. Her best constellations are C2 and C6, and everything between is sort of fluff. You'd be better saving for other characters or weapons unless you can afford to whale to C6. Overall, her constellations are just not it. So now that you know everything about Shenhe, we can finally talk about what makes her good, what makes her bad, and give kind of an overall review. On this channel, typically all of the things we look for in theory crafting are so we can make the characters that are not meta good. Now, Shenhe is like Kazuha. If he did low damage, could only be used in cryo, it had a worse debuff, and had bad energy generation. Now that doesn't mean Shenhe is completely useless, because as you may know, Kazuha is one of the strongest units in the game, so comparing her to him is rough. But it does mean that Shenhe has a very specific niche to fill to get her maximum value. One issue that I have with Shenhe is that there are other characters that do what she does that are 4-star units, and it makes it hard for me to justify calling her a good choice to pull for. With that being said, if you do have her, she'll perform fine, and you'll be able to clear the hardest content with her. It's not like she's bad, but she's not as amazing of a unit as we'd hope she'd be. Overall, if you want to play Shenhe, that's totally fine, because from a casual perspective, she's a super comfortable, easy, and fun unit to play. But from a meta perspective, I just want to let you know what you're getting into before you actually roll on her banner. Within her niche, she's a fine unit, but in terms of pull value versus someone like Kazuha, who can do everything she does and better, she will be less valuable to roll for. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you like Genshin Impact, and check out the Twitch if you like live content as well at twitch.tv/Braxophone. Let me know in the comments if you pulled Shenhe or if you like the unit, and I'll catch you guys later.